I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Welcome to episode 160 of the Time for Teachership podcast. Today, we're continuing the conversation in our series about transforming the systems that uphold inequity in our schools and districts. And specifically in this episode, we're continuing a conversation from the previous episode, episode 159 on grading for equity. Today, we're talking about rethinking averages and 0 to 100 scales specifically. So let's take a look at our grading policies together. Here we go. Before we jump into our conversation on grading for equity, rethinking averages, and 0 to 100 scales, I do want to go through the why. As I usually do, I like to cite the research and think about why are we even doing this? Because it's going to be a hard shift. This is certainly, as I talk about often, an adaptive leadership challenge. So A through F, 0 100 grades, they only work for a very small number of students. And these are the students that do well in school already. So we don't need, in a conversation about equity and transforming systems, to prioritize and center those students' wellness. They are going to be just fine, I promise you. I was one of those students who did really well. And meta studies back this up. They show that kids who get high grades are the ones that know how to do school. And these are often the students who have inequitable access to that information. I had access to that information because my parents were both teachers, right? I knew how to do school well. I was also just skilled at specific things that made me do school well. Maybe surprisingly to some listening to the podcast, I'm a rule follower in many aspects of my life. Of course, not all. I push for justice and resist rules that contribute to injustice, but I just did school well because I was trained to do school well. I had access to that information. I had access to the cultural capital of having an educator in my school district. That was my mom, and another educator, my dad, in a neighboring district. So that is first and foremost, right? We're privileging the students who already do well if we use that as an excuse that it's working for some kids. It's working for the kids who are already advantaged. The next thing is when we talk specifically about averages. Averages penalize students who enter the class without already knowing the content and skills. Now that's just silly, right? If we think about a class, it is designed to teach something. So on the first day or the first month of that class, you do not expect the students to know all the things, right? When we think about, and we talk about this in the previous episode, but this idea of competency-based grading and grading for skills that are transferable and have a long duration, they last the whole year. We are consistently working on a handful of skills, building those up. The first time I tried that in September, in United States schools anyways, or the northeastern of the United States schools start usually in September, I am probably not going to be that good at it. That's an expectation that I should have as a teacher and as a student. That should not be a surprise. As a family member of that child, I should not be surprised, right? This is the first time they're trying it. But a student who's struggling with that skill, of course, in the first month of school, they have a grade under an averaging system from that first practice, that assessment from quarter one, month one, that counts equally with a grade that they received on an assessment in the last month of school. That is bananas. That is absolutely just confusing to my brain when I really break it down and think about it. And I think most folks would agree. It's just that this is one of those systems and structures that we haven't questioned. Or maybe some folks have been questioning it, but we're fearful of maybe what other folks might think, and we're fearful of disrupting the status quo. So I think this is a perfect topic for this podcast, which is why we're spending 2 episodes on it, and probably will do more in the future. All right, one more piece on the research that I want to share before we move on to how do you actually address this. 0 to 100 scales seem to me to be based on the percentage of recall-based questions that a student gets right or wrong on a multiple choice test. That's what 0 to 100 is, right? It's like a percentage. I literally was just doing a coaching call with folks who were working on skill-based rubrics. And this is a new skill for these educators. So of course, there's going to be some questions, some confusion. And one of the things was kind of a default to that traditional mindset of like, I am assessing not the skill, but the content memorization. And so this teacher was basically trying to put a 0 to 100 scale of like, what's the percentage that I got correct or that a student got correct on a content-based factual recall test, and just kind of putting it into the competency category. So like 3 or 4 categories. So like the range of like 0 to 50 is here, and the range 50 to 75 is here, whatever. And so it just, I think, is very emblematic of like this traditional way of how we think of things and how it's easy for us to create percentages out of, okay, there's 10 questions on this test. You got 8 right. You got an 80. But what does that mean, right? And what are we actually assessing? So tests are inequitable. We found this in the research. They're not super effective at measuring transferable skills, which is what we know we should be prioritizing. And we look at the research that specifically targets project-based assessments and PBL classrooms versus traditional high-stakes testing environments. Those students in the PBL classrooms, they understand the content on a deeper level. They actually retain the content longer. And this is a great like punchline to this for people who are high-stakes testing advocates, which I don't honestly think there are many in terms of the educational world. But they still, those students in PBL classrooms, they still perform as well or even better on the high stakes tests than students who have been educated in a traditional setting where they're like practicing a lot of multiple choice and things. So I think there is a lot to say for rethinking averages and 0 to 100 scales, just based alone on the research. But now let's get to like, what do we do about this? So I think the first step is really to discuss the why with your staff. So share the research, share this podcast episode if that's helpful, but invite questions and concerns. Interrogate any sort of deficit language or harmful beliefs that arise in the discussion. So there might be a lot of, well, if I don't grade it this way, then students aren't going to do it. Or the student is highly motivated by being valedictorian, and what if this ruins their average? And I think these are all valid questions, right? I think we should dig into them a little bit, but interrogate kind of what underlies that. So who are the folks that we're concerned about that are taking up space in our brain in these conversations that are making us hesitant to move forward? Typically, in many conversations, not just conversations about grading, anything that has to do with inequity, the resistance to change and the folks in our heads as we're thinking about them and thinking about making the change, they are the folks who are currently benefiting from the system. And if we are bringing the conversation back to equity, if we're grounding it in equity, we are thinking about who is not benefiting from the system. And typically it's a much higher number of students than the students who are excelling under the current system, right? So even just in a numbers game, it's like, okay, this is like across the boards, we need to have this conversation and we need to flip the script here. And I do think it's really important here to ground this in your shared community values. If you do not have shared community values, go back and listen to an episode on that. It is really important to establish those in order to have these really critical conversations about adaptive challenges. Like that's at the heart of this. And that's why today's free resource actually is going to be about adaptive challenges. I'm going to link to you in the blog post version of this episode. You can grab it, but I'm going to link my root cause analysis worksheet. Goes through like the 5 whys, has a little bit of like data analysis questions, different things that you can do. I love it for strategic planning. And I do think this evolves into kind of a mini strategic planning session when you talk with the staff. We're identifying a challenge, right? Our current grading system is inequitable. These are the students who are disserviced. What's going on? How do we fix it? How do we make it better, right? That's an adaptive challenge. We need to make sure that our values are central in that, right? If we value equity, well, then that's going to inform our decision. If we value humanity, right, that's going to impact our decision. I think there's all of those values that you have laid out, and it's like, now we really test them out. Now we see how they come to life. I think after you discuss with the staff, or even parallel to, or, you can flip the order of these, but I think you also want to discuss the why with families and students. This is going to be a shift for students and families too. There may be some students and families who are really interested in this idea of this shift. There are probably going to be, honestly, most that are not interested because they probably don't know like the full extent of what you mean. So you need to communicate really clearly, like, what is this? What is the research on this? And once they hear all of the information, will probably be excited. But initially it's like, okay, this is something very different. Or maybe I heard things about this in the news and I am fearful for my child getting into college because like you grade on a different system or whatever, right? Like there's so many fears and they are grounded in like, I'm not quite sure about this, but my gut is to protect my child. And so I'm just going to like share my initial gut reaction. So bring folks into a conversation. Again, same thing you want to do with the staff. Invite questions, invite concerns, interrogate any of the beliefs that arise, center it in your shared community values. And by community, I mean, yes, you probably created staff community values and school community values. Like extend those and expand those to include the values of family and students as you discuss this. So you can discuss with students in like a larger platform. You can discuss this with students in classroom sized groups where they've already probably built shared community and community values. You definitely want to think about what clearly do we want? Why is it currently not working? What is the thing that we want and what is it not? So like, let's get clear about like, it's not going to be this. It is going to be this and why you're making that shift. And I think knowing, and this is kind of step 4, so I'll get to this in a minute, but knowing that you have the opportunity to co-create what the new grading policy actually looks like with families, with educators, with students, like in partnership, there's going to be more ownership of the final product and also reduced hesitancy at the first kind of, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing, because we want to pose it in a way that's like, we're thinking about doing this together, not to you, right? With you in community. I think also we want to make sure that we learn from folks who have done this. There are many, many schools and districts who have done this work already. So let's learn from them so that, you know, they've already made the mistakes. They've already gone through the hard things. Like, let's learn from them. One huge resource that is really my go-to, helped me with this work when I was a teacher, helped the school I was in. We did really well with their guidance, but I also, even as a coach, just go to them all the time. That is Competency Collaborative. I'll link to them in the blog post. They're an organization based in New York City. They're an excellent resource for all sorts of relevant research relating to graded for equity. They have a beautiful model. They have tons of examples of what does this rubric look like? What's a grading policy the school has? And also they have tons of stories of equitable grading shifts that schools or individual teachers have kind of gone on. And so they'll actually share stories of like, here's where I started in year 1, and this is the shift that we made first. And then we got to the second year, and then this is what we decided as a school community, right? It's super cool, especially if you're kind of hesitant or your stakeholders are kind of hesitant about this big shift. Just look at what other folks have done and the journey they've gone on. And I believe Competency Collaborative will say this as well, but there is no one right concrete path. It is like, let's have these underlying shared principles of grading for equity and assessing and feedback being prioritized over grading. And let's move forward with our community members to figure out what works best for us. There are guidelines from a Crescendo Ed group, I believe, that basically are taken from this big study they did, where they figured out that there are a couple different things to consider. And I just want to name them here, again, learning from those who have done it before. So in their research, they said, use a 0 to 4 scale instead of a 0 to 100 point scale, and avoid giving students any scores of 0, right? So a 0 is like, there is no effort made. And I think really important here too, is like, there were many, many opportunities to get it done. It wasn't like you missed the deadline, it's over, right? So we really decrease the idea of giving a 0 if any work is completed, and we give multiple opportunities for that work to be completed, right? That's not to say that if a student is just not ever showing work that like you need to give a 0. This is for a student who is trying, is putting in work. And when I say trying, I mean like at all, ever, after multiple opportunities, not like, oh, they didn't turn in the deadline, they're not trying, right? So I think these are really important points to consider. You want to weigh recent performance more heavily. This is super important. What I was saying before, month 1, very different from month 9 in your school year. We want to weight the month 9 way heavier. Like if you still want to count the month 1, fine. And there are actually models that are like, we don't even count month 1, right? We certainly don't count a practice attempt. Maybe we count the summative assessment from quarter 1, but there are some extremes where it's like, you don't even count anything aside from like what is done at the end, the last summative project, right? I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'm just saying, like, give it as a thought experiment, give it some thought, right? It makes sense theoretically. So weight the recent performance more heavily. I think this also gives students a chance if they're like sitting in December, like, wow, I'm still like not doing well in my grades. And certainly my students early on were thinking this, like, okay, well, this is nuts. I am sitting here at like a 2 out of 4. This, like, I am a student who really typically does well in like our first year of doing this. And it was like, okay, you need to know that the next few months are actually going to count more. So I need you to keep on, like, you are doing great. You are on the path. And I've seen the growth. You're only going to grow more. You are going to be pleased with the end of the year's final grade, the way that we average and weight more recent stuff. And they were, but it was a conversation to certainly have in, December, January, where there's usually that lull, there's that reset, right? Another thing to get back to their list is to grade content, not subjective effort, like attendance or homework. Grading for completion is far more kind of like fluffy grade inflation. Grading for like efforts, attendance is super inequitable, right? Because you can't like determine who had the access to be able to attend today. You don't know what's going on in their home, right? All these things. Your grade should be emblematic of what they can do with the content and skills, right? That's what the grade should be, not like button seat time. Allow retakes. We talked about that. Replace previous scores with current scores, right? So if they did poorly on the first draft, second draft, do better, great. That just completely replaces it. Create effective grade based on standard aligned rubrics. So the grades are based on standards aligned rubrics, So that's what we talked about in the previous episode, 159, that you are sharing with students. So right up front, here's the assessment, here's how I'm going to grade you. And again, when you create a year-long rubric, they already know what it is, especially when you're in like a grade team that really collaborates well. You might have an assessment, and the Competency Collaborative has shared this before in a video, which I can link to this episode, but they share an example of, I think it's the Young Women's Leadership Academy of Astoria in New York, that has like school-wide standards, 9th through 12th grade, regardless of subject area. And they are all content agnostic. So they know, like, argue as a standard is going to look different in a math class than a social studies class, but like, it's still the same like sentence that we recognize as like, here's the standard. So I think there's a ton of cool stuff there that you can do with that. I also think another thing that we're saying, I think this is a really interesting one, is using self-reflection, peer feedback, and supporting self-regulation to support independent learning skills. So you don't want to necessarily, in their research, they found you don't necessarily want to grade the independent learning skills. I know Competency Collaborative does say that's okay, and they put it under like a work habits, like a can't be more than 20%, I think is typically the advice, but I could be wrong on that, but that is, I think, really important. And when we have that leverage of self-reflection and peer feedback, we open up opportunities for teachers to then conference with students one-on-one and do a lot more of what I believe Competency Collaborative calls the cognitive coaching, which I love for students. Step 4 is to co-create an equitable grading policy. So you have discussed with staff, families, and students. You learn from who's already done it. Now you're co-creating the policy. Something that works for you. You're in partnership with all your stakeholders. You're considering the why of equity when making all of your decisions. Again, considering shared values. You're sure to leave the meeting or leave the whatever with the structures you need to put in place to make sure you're successful in implementation. There's a lot of structure. So actually that's step 5. I think you should implement with some solid systems and structures, specifically around feedback and revision. So give departments and teams the time to create department-wide or team-wide skill-based rubrics. That could take an entire year, but like, just give them the time, right? And that way you have embedded specificity and effectively feedback into the rubrics with which your teachers are assessing all of your students' work, right? These are year-long rubrics, awesome, less work for them, more consistency for the students, more reliability for tracking skill progression over time. Again, check out the previous episode for that if you're interested in some more information there. Next, I would create resource banks. So each teacher should have, or department or team, again, you can kind of crowdsource these as a group if you'd like, resource banks. So when students receive feedback, they have not yet met the standard, don't just leave them with that, right? Like, what can they do to progress? give them a next step. So you are going to want to share something with students, an instructional video list. You can even link those right into the rubrics themselves, which I love, texts as well as activities or mini projects so they can improve their skills, right? You want to make sure that they have what they need to continue to progress, not just leave them with a, nah, you're not there yet. That's going in the grade book, right? You can have like weekly or bi-weekly, whatever it would be for you, workshop or upgrade days that your teachers have put into place on their calendars, on their pacing calendars. And they say, these are days for revision or, taking that feedback I gave you on the last assessment and working on one of those mini activities that's in the resource bank. So this idea of giving revision opportunities, giving feedback, and then giving something for the students to do and having time in class to do that work, super important. And that's really making sure that you are not doing your typical grade inflation practices, like the homework or completion grades, attendance, effort grades, because it's like you don't have to, you no longer see grades as penalizing students, right? It's just, you will have as many chances as you can get. Every week, you will have a new chance to upgrade something, to revise something based on feedback, right? So you no longer need the inflation practices like grading for effort for a kid who is putting in the effort, right? They're going to get there because you've helped them build the skill. And finally, I would really get metacognitive here. So as you implement, you're asking for feedback on your feedback systems, right? Adapt as you need, but make sure maybe after a set amount of time, you're collecting the experiential data from students, families, educators. How's it going? What can we shift if we need to shift something? And then my very final tip is that this is definitely like the dream we're creating here. I want you to have that dream grading policy that's rooted in equity. If it is absolutely like a no-go for some reason this year, here's what I suggest you try. Whether you are leading a school where there's just a lot of resistance in some dimension, resistance from above, like whatever, what you can do, even as an individual classroom teacher who's like, the school's not going with this, but I want to try this. Maybe even as a leader, you can maybe have this piloted with a few teachers. I think that would be super cool and really have some quote unquote buy-in or like true ownership over the policy in that core group of teachers, and like the belief really spreads itself out. Okay, so here's what you can do. All feedback, grading, and rubrics use the competency-based categories, but at the end, if you have to convert it into a 0 to 100 scale, convert it. There are examples of this, and I actually, in the first couple of years we did this in one of the schools I worked at, that's what we had to do because the New York City grading system at that time, I think as of the school year 23-24, so this school year currently as we're recording, the DOE in New York City has shifted to include the 4-point grading scale for competency categories as an option to put on report cards. But until then, there had to be a conversion. So I'm going to link on the blog post an example of what one school, not in New York City, but one school just has a webpage up with that conversion. So you can check out what it might look like. But that's a way to still kind of check the box. Yeah, we did 0 to 100, but really on the ground, super feedback driven, super competency based. And all of the language that students and teachers and families are using is that language. So again, all the things, all of the links to all the research, that table I just talked about, my root cause analysis worksheet, all there for free for you on the blog post for this episode, which is located at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/160. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no strings attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.